India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi made his first overseas trip since his re-election to Moscow this week, where President Vladimir Putin honored him with Russia's highest award at a ceremony at the Kremlin. It is a meeting that was keenly watched by the US, China, and, of course, Ukraine, and presents a fine balancing act for Modi. India's oil imports from Russia have ballooned since the war in Ukraine, a fact that gives Delhi enormous bargaining power. I'm Jafar Hassan, and today's newsmaker is the rising influence of India. President Putin publicly described Modi as his dearest friend, and on the surface, India's long-standing relations with Russia appear rock solid. But Modi will be aware of not only the reaction from the West, with whom he has good relations, but also Putin's increasingly close relationship with China, with whom India has a complicated relationship. India's partnership with Russia goes back to the Cold War. Russia is a key weapon supplier and has provided technical assistance to build several Russian-designed nuclear power stations. In the past year, India's imports of grain from Russia have increased by a factor of 22. But it is oil imports that have really flourished since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In 2021, Russian exports to India were just below $5.5 billion. But last year, it surpassed $60 billion. Meanwhile, in the same period, Indian exports rose from $2.6 billion to just $4.3 billion. India's oil imports from Russia have skyrocketed from 43,000 barrels of oil per day in 2021 to 777,000. And that goes some way to explaining President Putin's warm praise for Modi. With Western sanctions on Russia and military aid to Ukraine complicating Moscow's war effort, President Putin has been busy carving out his position in what is increasingly becoming a multipolar world. He has held summits with China's President Xi Jinping and North Korea's Kim Jong-un, and he remains a staunch ally of Iran. And the meeting with Modi is another bid to cement ties with a rising global powerhouse.
It is difficult to overestimate your contribution to the formation of a sustainable basis for Russian-Indian cooperation on the international stage, where both our countries defend the principle of multipolarity and strict adherence to international law, work together in the interests of ensuring stability, global and regional security, and closely cooperate within the framework of BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
With their talks taking place just ahead of a major NATO summit in Washington, Prime Minister Modi was careful to reference the war in Ukraine and gave what appeared to be an implicit rebuke to President Putin. A day earlier, Russia launched a lethal strike on a children's hospital in Kyiv.
When there is war, battles, or even militant attacks, every person who believes in humanity feels pain when they see death, especially when innocent children are killed. The sight of innocent children dying shatters your heart, and that pain is extremely horrific. I had a detailed discussion on this issue with you. As a friend, I have always said that for the bright future of our coming generations, peace is of utmost importance. But I also know that solutions are not possible on battlegrounds. Amid bombs, guns, and bullets, solutions and peace talks do not succeed. We will have to follow the path to peace only through talks.
It was a comment that forced the Kremlin to deny there were disagreements between the two leaders. The United States, meanwhile, has watched on with concern, urging Modi to use his influence to help bring an end to the war in Ukraine.
We made quite clear directly with India our concerns about their relationship with Russia, and so we would hope India and any other country, when they engage with Russia, would make clear that Russia should respect the UN Charter, should respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
So as India's economic growth and rise on the global stage continues at pace, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's balancing act between the global powers appears to be working strongly in his favor. But can he continue holding stable ties with all sides? Joining me to discuss this are from Kolkata, a state executive member of the BJP, Shishir Bajoria. From Moscow, journalist for Sputnik International, Dmitry Babich, and from Cambridge in the UK, professor at Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies, Des Roches. Gentlemen, great to have you here with us on the newsmakers. Shishir, let me begin with you now. Modi referred to President Putin as his dearest friend during this visit. So, as we highlighted, with the U.S. State Department urging India to advocate for Ukraine's territorial integrity, how do you reconcile Modi's close ties with Russia and its diplomatic balancing act?
Well, first of all, we have to recognize one thing. This summit between Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji and the Russian President Mr. Putin was actually not the first or the second or the third. It was the 22nd summit between our countries. As far as Modi ji's visit, he did 4 visits in his first term, 1 in his second, and he started his third term with the very first foreign visit to Moscow for the summit with Mr. Putin. Now, this balancing act that you're talking about, now, see, this is a much bigger thing. Russia has been a time-tested friend of India. I'm going back even during the Cold War days. The relationship was a little different, where India's relationship with the West was not what it is today. Today, India's relationship with the West, with the US and the Western European countries, or the other Western countries, is very good, on a very strong wicket. Our time-tested friend, the Russians, are still very much there. Russia and India have stayed with each other through thick and thin, through bad and good. So, and this is what is continuing. As far as our Prime Minister is concerned, he is very clear. He is the Prime Minister of India, and whatever he does, the first interest is that of the Indian our countrymen, and second, the other is that it is also in world interest, because India's interest is not divergent to the world interest. So this is where, and he has been very open about it at each forum, whether it's in the UN or it's in any multilateral forum, or even in some of our bilateral meetings.
Okay, Dmitry, let me come to you now. So President Putin also called Prime Minister Modi his dearest friend, and this is during a time of global outcry over Ukraine, and certainly, according to some, this will be seen as a strategic move. So how does this reflect Russia's need to fortify its alliances amidst Western sanctions?
I think that first, of course, it's a coincidence that this tragedy happened in Kiev exactly at the moment of Prime Minister Modi's visit. And I think it was unfair on the side of Western powers and Mr. Zelensky to make a connection between Mr. Modi's visit and the tragedy in Kiev. As for the aims of Russia in this dialogue, obviously, I can quote the New York Times. It is impossible to talk about Russia's isolation after this visit. Because look, Putin has a very busy diplomatic schedule. Just during the last 2 months, he met just about all the leaders of Central Asian countries. He met Prime Minister Modi. It's about, he met African leaders. Before he met the Chinese leader, he paid a visit to China. So it doesn't look like Russia is isolated. This is very important. But I think the most important thing is that Mr. Modi is offering the world hope for peace in Ukraine. Just like the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who paid a visit to Moscow and to Kiev. So Mr. Orban is doing something that basically the head of European diplomacy should be doing. Okay. He is trying to find out what's the position of one side, what's the position of the other side. He is doing the mission of an intermediary. The West immediately lashed out at Mr. Orban, and now it's lashing out at Mr. Modi. But at least they are trying. They are trying to end this tragedy. And what is the West doing? It just supports one of the sides. This is not diplomacy. This is a one-sided position.
Okay, David, now, Prime Minister Modi's visit to Moscow, timed with a NATO summit, certainly raises questions about strategic signaling. So is this, in your view, a calculated move to showcase India's independent foreign policy stance, or a necessity driven by economic and defense interests?
I don't know the exact logic behind the timing. I mean, it's always possible. People assume looking outside that every decision a government makes is timed and calculated, but when you're actually inside government, chance and errors, actually happen. So I wouldn't attribute that to it. But look, there's only three things that Russia exports that people actually want. One are weapons, one is wheat and fertilizer, and then the third one is oil. India needs all three. And, in the West, at the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was a recognition that, an absolute cessation of Russia's oil trade would have a disparate effect on countries like India. So instead, what we have is this price cap of $60. India has been taking advantage of that. They're desperately in need of energy. So I don't think we're happy with this, but I think that we're going to learn to live with this. There's another interpersonal dimension that hasn't been broadly discussed in the press, but bear in mind, both Putin and Modi have personal experience of and resentment of the West's dominant role in the financial world. So until he was elected prime minister, Modi was unable to travel to the West because of his alleged role in the Gujarat Muslim massacre in 2002. And Putin, of course, relatives of him, Sergei Lavrov's daughter, they can travel to countries in the global South that were at under colonialism, but they can't go to Paris. Lavrov can't visit his daughter where she lives. And so there is still an element of isolation, but I wouldn't read too much into this beyond the economic necessities and perhaps a little bit of interpersonal irritation with the global financial order.
Okay, let me pick up on the trade part, and let me come to you, Shishir. With India's trade with Russia soaring to $65 billion, primarily driven by discounted oil purchases, how does this economic relationship influence India's foreign policy stance?
Jafar, permit me to make one point before I answer your question. Because David, when he was completing, he spoke about, good that he prefixed it by saying alleged, when he spoke about Gujarat, alleged. West can say what they want, they can do what they want. Who they permit is their job, their discretion. But none of the courts of India has held Modi ji guilty. Even the Supreme Court of India, I'm sure in the civilized world, we take it that the court of a country knows what is best for the country and what is the correct stand. Just as a clarification, because David, you touched that point, but I appreciate you use the word alleged. Now, coming to Jafar's question, look at the joint statement issued by the two sides after this summit was over. The target of this trade, bilateral trade, is now $100 billion. The trade between the two friendly countries is on its way up and up. What does it mean vis-a-vis India's trade across the world? Our trade targets with even the Western countries are on the way up. See, if India, as we have declared our policy as a declared policy, our target is to become the third economic power, and we have a definite timeline for it. So for this, we are going to move the countries' bilateral trade with each of the countries on a northwards. The same applies for Russia, and the same applies for Western countries.
Okay, but if I may add one question here. Now, some would say that in some ways, India's oil imports are dependent on Russia. So can India really maintain this dependency on Russia without alienating its Western allies?
Till now, we have not alienated our Western allies. Our Western allies are very much allies, like Russians are our friends. So we have not alienated. In fact, the oil imports that we do from Russia, it's known to the West, and we have been very upfront and clear about it. Maybe if we were not upfront and clear about it, there could have been problems. But the Prime Minister Modi ji has made it very clear. The people of Bharat, for him, comes first because he's the Prime Minister of Bharat. And this So we had to control our prices. We had to control our foreign currency chest, which we have very successfully done, despite the world going through a roller coaster.
Okay, now, Dmitry, we mentioned China in the introduction to this program with Russia's increasing alignment with China. How critical is India when it comes to support to balance this equation? And what role does Modi's visit play in this broader strategic framework?
Well, first, I would like to make a small correction. You know, Professor Des Roches said that there are only three things that Russia can do for India, and that is to export oil, wheat, and fertilizer. Well, the main contract that was signed during this visit and the main project was the construction of nuclear power plants in India. Everyone knows that Russia has the technology to build reliable, cheap nuclear plants. And nuclear energy, now in the times of climate change, is the energy of the future. So indeed, we were ourselves surprised, you know, when the West imposed all these sanctions on us in 2022. A lot of people expected the standard of living here to drop. And it didn't, you know. I think we had an inferiority complex before the West, which was caused by many years of socialist economy. In fact, we can provide for ourselves. We don't need any handouts from anyone. This is the main reality that stands behind our relationship with both India and China. We are not asking for gifts from India or from China. Yes, we sold oil to India at a discount, but now that money transfers between India and Russia are becoming easier.
If I may, Dmitry, is there a concern in Russia that Moscow deepening its ties with China could overshadow its relationship with New Delhi?
Absolutely no, because we have been hearing from the West for so many years that only democracies do not fight with each other. No, not only Western democracies don't fight with each other. Any responsible country with a responsible government will find a way to balance interests with other countries. Russia, India, and China will all have responsible governments which do not want to quarrel with each other, which do not want to force any other country to accept our system of government. That was the case in the communist times. That is not the case now. Now the West wants to impose its system of government on other nations. In that sense, the West is looking more and more like the Communist International in the first half of the 20th century. We don't want to force anything on India. We don't want to force anything on China. So we will find a way to straighten the differences. If there are differences between India and China, we are ready to help. And I know that basically India and China, they have responsible leaders who will find a way out of any difficulty in the relations between these two countries.
Okay, now, David, some experts would argue that there's a significant trade imbalance between India and Russia right now, especially with India's exports at just $4 billion, and this certainly underscores a dependency on Russian imports. How might this economic reality shape India's diplomatic engagements with both Russia and the West?
Well, India is in a position where the West is favorably disposed towards India and has been for a significant period of time, even during the Cold War when India was determinedly non-aligned in a manner that seemed to most in the West to be aligned with the wrong side. But there's always been a fondness for it, rhetoric like the world's largest democracy, and there's an affinity for India that exists for few other countries. So India is kind of getting a pass on this. We recognize that they're in a difficult position, and they're being you're not seeing, for example, secondary sanctions on imports of Russian oil because we realize that. But at the end of the day, India's development has not come from engagement with Russia. The explosive development in IT and training, India has made an investment in education and training, but the markets for that overwhelmingly they're not in Russia. So India is very, very determined to maintain a presence and friendly relations with the West. And they are reliant upon the support of the Indian diaspora in the West for a lot of things, particularly remittances and education. The Indian diaspora in Russia is a different story. So, I think that there's a natural affinity there that geostrategic events like the Russian invasion of Ukraine will not disturb the general trend. There'll be hiccups, but the general trend is closer ties.
Okay, fascinating insights. Now, Shishir, India has historically maintained a policy of strategic autonomy. Given the increasing Western hostility towards Russia, how sustainable is this policy in the long run, especially with rising tensions in the global geopolitical landscape?
See, it's a fact which we all acknowledge that there is a conflict in the region. I'm not getting into who attacked whom, but there's a conflict. How can this stop? This can only stop with dialogue. What has Prime Minister Modi ji said not once, not twice, many times, even during this visit? He is one of the very few leaders who could meet Mr. Putin and said, this is not the era of war. Now, this has to end, and only dialogue can bring an end to it. That is number one. Number two, as far as our relationships with the West and with the other powers, we are talking of Russia at the moment, we have made it very clear that India would like, and India is doing, an act of being friends on both sides. And I'm sure there's somebody would like that everything should come to a normalcy. I know it's difficult. I know what I'm saying. Someone will say it's theory, but it's not. This war has to end, and only a dialogue can bring an end to it. One more point I'll just try to touch on, which Dmitry mentioned about nuclear. And even during Modi ji's the very recent visit yesterday, when he was shown around, and the role which Indian companies have played in a nuclear power plant, which has been set up in our neighborhood. So we have cooperation. And what David mentioned about our IT, our education, and its tie-ups with the West, of course, it's a reality. Okay. Look around, see the, what do you call, the Silicon Valley. Every third person in Silicon Valley is an ethnic Indian.
All right. Now, Dmitry, let me come to you. So Prime Minister Modi emphasized during this visit, he emphasized the humanitarian impact of conflicts. And I think he was referring to the bombing of a children's hospital in Ukraine. How does Russia perceive such statements from a close ally? And do they really influence Moscow's narrative of the Ukraine conflict?
I don't see here a direct referral to what happened in Kiev, because it is not yet clear what exactly had happened. I can only assure you that, of course, Russia does not want to destroy children's hospitals. Their aims are military, sometimes it's the energy infrastructure, but certainly if it happened, it was unintentional. And also, don't forget that the Ukrainian side is also striking the Russian territory now. They have organized many terrorist acts, which were deliberate, deliberately killing people, not only military, but also peaceful journalists, politicians. So I think Mr. Modi understands that there are no angels and demons in this war.
Okay, you made your point. Now, David, let me come to you. So the global reaction to Modi's visit, especially from the US and Ukraine, it certainly highlights the complexities of India's foreign policy. Mm-hmm. How do you think this may impact India's global image and its role as a major economy in international diplomacy? I mean, do you think there is a risk that India's nuanced position could be misunderstood or misrepresented on the global stage?
No, I think there's a risk that India's position will be completely understood and properly represented, which is, look, in spite of what Dmitry told you, only one country invaded in overwhelming numbers a sovereign neighboring state whose borders are undisputed, whose borders are internationally recognized to include by the invading country. And everything bad that happened in Ukraine is as a direct result of Russia's imperialist ambitions to reconquer the Soviet Union's former province of Ukraine. That is a pretty widespread view in the West. If India shows itself to be close to Russia in a manner that goes directly contrary to Western interests, I think that there is, a recognition of India's parlous energy situation, and so they're willing to cut them some slack. But if they're seen to be active cooperators or enablers of Russia's imperialist invasion, then we'll see things like this Indian diaspora or the Indian technology infrastructure that is reliant on Western and, for most part, American technology. We'll have to start looking at, will this technology have a way to migrate to Russia? And there would probably be restrictions as a prudent measure to protect Western security. That's something that nobody wants, particularly India. And it's something that they need to think about. Right. So I think to keep their relationship as it is, which is basically quid pro quo, right. And there is a personal affinity, I think serves India's interest best.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. David, I'll have to give you the last word. Shishir, Dmitry, David, thanks very much for joining me today here on
I hope that was not a threat by
David. Thank you.
And thanks for watching. Don't forget you can follow us on X and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Jafar Hasnan. See you next time.